Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and we're continuing our talk about the Aztecs. So what were the religious beliefs of the Aztec people?
Well, their religious beliefs were all pervasive. They kind of believed that they lived in a kind of end times Debbie Downers of the world. They were quite fatalistic. They believed in the magical and the mystical. If you look at their poetry is quite fatalistic. This is just one example. Even jade is shattered, even gold is crushed, even the quetzal plumes are torn. One does not live forever on this earth. We endure only for an instant.
Huh.
So you get that kind of, the end is nigh. They have sorcerers who have state jobs. They believed in shape-shifting. And again, it's class-based, which I find fabulous. Common people could shape-shift into weasels or turkeys. Not good around Thanksgiving time, I'm guessing.
No.
But if you were a noble, you could transform or shapeshift into like a jaguar or some kind of fierce beast. That's kind of cool. They have over 100 gods, and each of the gods needed to be appeased through human sacrifice, whether it's the flailing of skin off a victim or their more typical sacrifice. So Aztec priests were trained from an early age. They had three main duties: the performance of rituals, the administration and care of the temples, and education. And they, of course, were the ones who kept the sacred books, and they had great knowledge of astronomy, calendars, and maths, of course, because it's important to know when to sacrifice, not just who to sacrifice. Yep. You have to get the when right. So they would always look for auspicious signs, and we've seen this in other cultures as well, stargazing. There are lots of different ranks of priests or the priesthood. The elite group were the fire priests. So the Aztec religion focused on the sun and the 5 suns. So sun and sun, both spellings. They believed that every night the sun set and a struggle with the stars began. So it wasn't sure, you weren't sure that the sun was going to come back up. And the only way to ensure that the sunrise would rise again was to offer human sacrifice. And so, of course, you needed a constant supply of people, and each calpulli in each region would need to meet quotas. They also wanted, nothing but the best. You don't want, some old rubby-dub as your sacrificial victim. How would the gods feel then?
That's true.
So they had things called flowery wars. The word flower as in flower growing in your garden. Flowery wars. These are fictional wars that were staged, and the people that survived were, of course, the good warriors, and then they could be used in sacrifices. So you couldn't win for losing. And they have, as I said, a number of these gods. Tlaloc is the rain god, Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent god, Camaxtli, the hunting god, Mictlan is the god of the underworld, and they have a great creation story as well that talks about the cycles that we live in, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But again, if we look at Diego Duran's History of the Indies of New Spain, this is, of course, from an outsider's view, and although we've seen Diaz being quite impressed by some elements of Aztec society. Father Diego Duran explains the sacrificial part and the fact that the Aztec believed that only the gift of human hearts would appease one of their top gods and stop him from bringing disaster to civilization. So this again is a direct quote from the History of the Indies of New Spain. So he's talking about the feast day. They're actually it's a particularly special day, but Montezuma is there, his body blackened with soot and applied in such a way that it caught the light. They placed crowns of fine feathers with gold and precious stones upon the heads of Montezuma and the priests. On each arm they wore a sheath of gold reaching from the elbow to the shoulder. On their feet were richly worked jaguar skin sandals inlaid with gold and gems. They were robed in splendid royal mantles and loincloths done in the same manner as the mantles, and from their backs hung miniature bowls of finely worked jade, and they had jeweled plugs attached to holes in their noses. So this is the king and the priest appearing before the assembly, and they were actually, I think it was to inaugurate the stone that was in the likeness and image of the sun. So they're at the top, and then the 5 priests of sacrifice followed, and they were to hold down the feet, the hands, and the heads of the victims, and the priests were painted with red ochre. and they're all kind of dressed up as well. And the 5 priests entered and claimed the prisoner, who stood first in the line at the skull rack. I think you'd know you were in trouble if somebody said, "Hey, could you line up over there?"
If there's a rack of skulls,
yeah, yeah. So,
especially skulls you recognize.
Yeah. Oh, that would be even worse. I'd be like, "Mommy, oh, that's where you went to." So each prisoner they would take to the place where the king stood. They'd force him to stand on the stone, which is the figure and likeness of the sun. They then threw him on his back. One took him by the right arm, another by the left, another by the left foot, another by his right, while the 5th priest tied his neck with a cord and held him down so he couldn't move. The king lifted the knife on high and made a gash in his breast, and having opened it, extracted the heart and raised it high with his hand as an offering to the sun. And then when the heart had cooled, he tossed it into the circle and took some of the blood in his hand and sprinkled it in the direction of the sun. In this way, the sacrificers killed 4 one by one, and then the high priest came and killed another 4, and so they were slain until it was every last man had perished. And then at the end of the sacrifice, they went and had a kind of big party, and so it continues with that. Everyone took part in a solemn banquet with great festivities. So when you're cleaning up the image of the Aztec, you still have to deal with the fact that at times there were so many sacrificial victims that they couldn't even perform that, and they had to just kind of roll them down from the top of the temples and smash them to the bottom. So I suppose it explains some of the opposition later on to the Aztec, if you in fact have these quotas that you have to meet, and you constantly have to be bringing in sacrifices. Their creation myth is really, really, really good. This is seen in, of course, their literature and their poetry. Lots of oral stuff at first, and great value placed on the speaking skills of men, of nobles, and of priests, their oratorical skills, and to speak well. You had to be able to speak well to achieve any kind of high status at court. And then the poems and the histories and the literature were recorded by the Spanish in Nahuatl, which is the language that they used. And you can divide it up into history, poetry, mythology, and hymns. So the myths of creation, there's a high god that's actually 2 gods, and they have 4 sons, and the cycle of creation and destruction begins with the birth of the 4 sons. And I won't tell you all of them, but I'll just explain that each. So there's 5 sons. That's 5 periods, S-U-N. So 5 sons, and each son was controlled by a different god and peopled with a distinctive people. And then each son was destroyed by disaster. So it's like the 5 stages of man. So in the 4th son, this was the era of the gatherers. So the people who ate seeds, and at the end they were turned into fish. And then you have the great flood. Earlier you have, instead of people, it's monkeys, and they eat specific things, and then there's a disaster that kills them off. And in the 5th son, which is the one that we're in just now, the sun god is the deity, and the people are maize eaters. Now we heard about that from the Maya, remember? So they'll be destroyed by earthquakes, and then all the humans will be eaten by sky monsters.
Ooh,
which explains...
hate those.
Yeah, I know. It explains a lot of the sci-fi stuff that we see. And the destruction can only start at the end of the 52-year calendar round, the 1 reed year, and the last one is in the early 1500s. And the last one, the next one that's going to come, that's going to end everything, is due to come in the year 2027. So you've got the Mayan world ending in 2012, and the Aztec fairly close behind. Oh, I thought the end of the world had come right there.
Just on cue.
And then there's also the mythology of the birth of the sun at Teotihuacan, which is really interesting. So you have when the earth was peopled with men, and there was maize, all the gods gathered to bring out the sun because everything was in the dark. And 2 gods in particular built a pyre for a fire sacrifice, and one of the 2 gods had to throw himself into this pyre, and he tried 4 times, but each time he's like, no, can't do it. So the other god did it. So the other god jumps into the fire, shaming the first one, who then, of course, jumps into the fire himself. And then a great light appears in the east, and then another light, because it's 2 gods that have jumped into the fire instead of the one that's supposed to go in. And the gods that were left, that were watching, thought that this was too bright, so they threw a rabbit at the second one, and it became the moon.
Huh.
So you get the sun and the creation of the sun and the moon, which is kind of a cool story. But the sun didn't move in the sky. They're expecting the sun to move, from one side to the other. So the gods sent a falcon out to ask why, and the sun who recently sacrificed God, replied, "Because I want their blood, their precious substance." And so all the remaining gods cut their chests and offered their hearts up. And the Aztec believed that people also had to provide blood and hearts to keep the sun going. So, really good explanations of why you need this kind of sacrifice. So that's, a little bit about Aztec religion. Of course, it's very complex, and the names are almost unpronounceable, I think, for anybody in the West. It's like, I bought 12 vowels and 72 consonants, and that's the name of one of my gods. So we won't go into that. But, of course, Fascinating People is a really good book for students by, I think it's Michael Smith, just called The Aztecs. Fabulous, explains every kind of element of their society. Very readable and, good for kind of university level stuff.
Well, what about astronomy and science?
Again, calendars are absolutely vital. Their timekeeping is so important. So they have the 260-day and the 365-day calendar. The 260-day calendar, same as the Mayan, used to note when rituals are to take place and also for forecasting, so for predicting the future. It has the same cycle of 20 name days and 13 number days, and it comes in a cyclical manner. So every day has a number day and a name day. So you've got 260 unique combinations, and then after the 260 days it starts all over again. So you have that, and then you have the annual calendar, the 365-day solar calendar with the 18 months of 20 days each, and then the 5 unlucky days at the end. So the same kind of thing, and this is the calendar that they use to keep track of the seasons and the agricultural schedule. The markets are held according to this calendar. Every 5th day you would have a market day, because you've got a 20-day month, so it's 4 weeks of 5 days. So whereas we would think of the weekend, the Saturday and the Sunday, their kind of break would be the 5th day. And again, you put the two calendars together, you come up with the 52-year cycle. That's the one reed year. And as I said before, the Spaniards get to Tenochtitlan in a one reed year when they're expecting visits from the gods. And it's a very difficult way of timekeeping, sophisticated but difficult, because all of the years have names as well. And so Tenochtitlan is founded in the year 2 Cali. So this could be 1273, 1325, 1377, or 1429, but we know from other sources that it's actually 1325, but you wouldn't know because the same year name comes up over and over again,
yeah.
right? They're avid sky watchers. The tracking of the night skies is done by the priests, of course, to keep track of the rituals. They used fixed locations in temples and buildings, and they tracked the rising and the setting of the sun, the moon, the planets, looked at the stars on the horizon, and they too used the crossed sticks to do that. Along a sight line, and they were ultra concerned about the direction of the sun at sunrise, because it varies through the year, and of course their territory is quite large. So it rises at its northernmost point on June 21st, the solstice, and then at its southernmost point on December 21st, the winter solstice. And so they calculated the length of the solar year by its position from solstice to solstice. And people still celebrate the summer solstice.
They do.
Any
excuse to have a party.
I just call them hippies. But you just go out there and have some fun. So they designed buildings, and they chose locations so that the sun would rise at precise points in those buildings, and the equinoxes and the solstices. They also tracked the passage of the Pleiades constellation to celebrate the start of the 52-year calendar round. And they calculated lunar months and other celestial cycles, and they watched comets, and they watched for shooting stars and things like that. And they're great innovators in terms of technology. And of course, they use the works of other people. They build on the Mayan, irrigation, terraced farming. They used raised fields. But they use it on a greater scale than ever before, so that in itself is a great achievement. They used, or they made modifications to blade production, especially for obsidian, to again produce the sharpest blades anywhere, anytime. And their bronze production was very sophisticated, although it's supposed to be the Tarascan people, not the Aztec, that they actually borrow this from. They're highly skilled at metallurgy. They produce copper and tin and things like that. They're also involved in rubber production, textile production, ceramics, stonework, featherwork, you name it. And they're impressive builders. They use lime plaster for floors and walls, and it's like concrete, and it's lasted in many cases for over 500 years. So really, really substantial. And they built sophisticated irrigation canals and aqueducts to bring water, remember, clean water to the capital city. Great architects and engineers, and they're good at maths. They use a base 20 numbering system, and this was used for trade goods because goods were measured by counts, not by weight. Now, the other just kind of interesting thing about them is their attitude towards medicine and illness. So they attribute illness, we've seen this in other cultures as well, to three causes: supernatural, magical, and natural. So for supernatural, this would be a disease or affliction that was thought to be sent to you from the gods as punishment, and so it would have to be treated by giving the appropriate religious offerings and or confessing to a priest that you'd kind of fallen off the right track. Magical illness, that would be caused by a sorcerer. They usually call them an owl man, and they would cast spells causing illness or death, and the spells were found through divining, so through divination. So they would cast maize kernels to find out what had happened to you and what disease you had been seized with, or they would look into water, so water and maize kernels, and the treatment for that usually involved jade or quartz crystals, or you'd have to, it would be like, what's that show on the TV, remember, they'd have to eat like worm
Fear
innards.
Factor?
Fear Factor, yeah, it'd be like that. You'd have to eat worms or drink skunk blood, or kind of, yeah, well, which tells us that they had skunks, so that's cool. Yeah, I didn't know that.
That's
And
true.
worms. Yeah, they had worms as well. Natural illness could be cured by physicians, and they had female curers who worked in people's homes. We don't know a lot about them because, of course, nobody was interested, not really recorded in the chronicles. But the definition of a good doctor is included, and that would include someone who'd worked with herbs, who had tried and tested remedies who could massage aches, who could set bones, who could give purges and potions, who could cut and sew wounds, and who could stop bleeding. So very practical, the physicians. So things like snake bites, of course, we've all seen this in Western movies. You cut the wound, you suck out the poison, you spit it out. Yeah, so that comes from the Aztec. Setting fractures, they set bones with plaster casts and a splint. For head wounds, they would clean the area with urine and then apply an ointment of sap and herbs, and they would bind it to keep the air out, so they keep keep infection away. They had hundreds and hundreds of natural herbs, and they actually had a botanical gardens. And when we think about botanical gardens, we think about, the gardens at Kew in London, or even the one in Glasgow, or, all over the place. These are actually something that Spaniards take back to Europe from the Aztec world, the fact that you have botanical gardens with all these different herbs growing all sorts of different plants, and finding out what the uses are for them, and there's supposed to be about at least 500 herbal concoctions used to work on disease. And we've seen their writing, that they too write on stone and pottery and ceramics. They used painted manuscripts, these folding books folded like an accordion. They have great technical abilities and artistic abilities. You see wall murals, sculptures, paintings, statues to represent gods. They produce books using paper, deerskin, or cloth, and the paper is from the inner bark of the fig tree, and they would lay the wet fibers of the bark out, beat them, and that would fuse them together, and then they would polish them with stone, cut them down to regular sizes, and then coat them with white lime to stiffen them, and that's where the books come from. So really quite sophisticated there as well. And they had, of course, a clan, or a group of professional men or scribes who specialized in creating one specific type of books. They would have history books, they'd have religious books, they'd have administrative books, they would have maps of the city-states, they would have land records, revenues for the kings, and the Aztec writing system is one of the 5 systems of writing that's developed in that area. The Mayan one is, of course, one of them as well. And they used pictures and glyphs and the written texts. They seem to have used them as mnemonic devices, not so much a book to be read, but a mnemonic device, so that when you looked at this, you would remember 10 other things that were important, right? So it'd be like studying for an exam where you have your little sheet and you try and get all your information down into the absolute minimum amount and then use it from there. So they too have pictographs, ideographs, and phonetics, and they have a pictograph, like a pictograph, a good example of a pictograph would be a pictograph of a skull rack. So you'd know immediately what that was. And then they have ideographs that are representations of ideas and meanings, and then they have phonetic signs to explain things as well. So really, really quite sophisticated. And what happens to them is, of course, I think that they would have continued on in their natural way, in this natural rise and fall of civilizations and empires. But there is a bit of opposition to them because of the need for sacrifices, because they are, you know, kind of well organized, but they're stopped dead in their tracks by another factor, and that's the arrival of Europeans. And Europeans, the ones that arrive, aren't looking for them. They're looking for a fast and easy passage to China and India, going in the opposite direction from the new Ottoman Empire that controls the land routes to the east, really looking for a different way to get to them. So they think if in the maps of the day, there's nothing there between kind of Ireland and Japan, so these bright sparks think we'll go that way and we'll get to China, the riches of China, the riches of India, and of course they get nowhere near that at all because they're stopped by this landmass right in the middle, and it's the Aztec. So Aztec society is going to collapse because of that, and because not so much because of the superior Spanish technology and war technology and the dogs of war, although that's all part of it, but because when the Spaniards arrive, they're actually bringing all of the diseases of the old world into this new world at the one time, and this is a world where people have been separated from the rest of humanity for at least 15,000 years, and maybe for as long as up to 100,000 years. So they're a complete untouched population. So all these diseases, measles, smallpox, influenza, they're all become killer diseases, and the population within a few generations of the arrival of the Spaniards, the population of the Americas drops by up to 95%.
Oh my goodness.
So huge. People are wiped out. And of course this is one of the reasons that you have the beginning of the triangular slave trade, because the Spaniards, having come to the Americas, want, you know, other people to do the work down the mines and get this, and the indigenous population is dying off, like just in huge numbers and very quickly. So they bring slaves from Africa to the New World, and they don't fall victim to European diseases because we all march out of Africa. Africans are the original human man, and so they don't suffer from these. So they're excellent, in a sense, for the Spanish, excellent replacement workers. Right.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
And
very cool history.
Yeah, and that wraps up our chat about the Aztecs.
Yep.
Join us in the History Hut for more next time.
Thanks.